Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a very long title, and I will. The presentation will not be that long. So, 2 more presentations to go, and you're through. But with this paper, I'm taking you to the Merkozy land. We talked a lot about the periphery and national politics, so we're going to see, trying to see what happened in the core. Briefly, I'll excuse my co-author today. Although she's traveling to Europe, as you may know, very often, she's not on the right side of the Atlantic at the moment. This paper is the first draft. We want to revise it pretty soon, so we're very happy about any kind of feedback from you. So, if I have to introduce this topic, but we've talked already a lot about it. When the Greek debt crisis broke out, this was in the fall 2009, we saw that the French-German engine had to be started again, although after the enlargement, many people said that it was very old-fashioned, that new political dynamics that we could observe new dynamics, and that French-German engine was quite old-fashioned, but actually what we see is that it was necessary to start it again to try to face this situation. It was not easy because, as you know, the positions of France and Germany were very contrasted at the very beginning of this crisis. In France, Nicolas Sarkozy, in the first place, advocated neo-Keynesian solutions, stimulus solutions, also a greater, deeper integration through greater economic governance, and a quick bailout for Greece. On the other hand, in Germany, if you remember, Chancellor Merkel delayed action until May, from the late fall 2009 until May 2010, until the risk of contagion to other EU countries had become so so important that actually in the meantime even Barack Obama had made a phone call to see what is really happening in Europe. And Angela Merkel was really reluctant towards a bailout, towards financial help. Nevertheless, a few months later, in the spring 2010, and we're here focusing on 2010, 2011, some deals or successive deals had been made between both countries, and the EFSF as well as the ESM were born. The austerity turn had been taken by both countries, and also we had some measures to go towards the strengthening of economic governance in the EU, including systems for fines and sanctions in the case that the member states would not respect the new rules. So how can we explain this convergence in the positions from a situation where both countries had very contrasted traditions and views, but also how we wanted to explain the different views on the leadership in both countries. Because Nicolas Sarkozy was actually quite successful in legitimizing its own actions. Angela Merkel was criticized for delaying action, but on the other hand, was also responding to some demands from the German electorate. So views and also comments from the international press, from observers, were contrasted and mixed. So, of course, part of the explanation lies in the long-standing national economic and political traditions that are very different, as you know, in France and in Germany. But also, we think it's really important to put the stress on the dynamics of the debates and on how leaders, these two leaders, have reconfigured and changed their positions over time. here, what's particularly interesting to us is the articulation between intergovernmental negotiations on the one hand and domestic politics, domestic public opinion on the other hand. In this respect, a number of approaches are very useful, starting with the theory or the framework of sorry, there's a mistake here in the slide. By the way, it's not the double game, is what we call it. What we called it. It's actually the two-level game put forward by Putnam and grounded in an interest-based calculations and this idea that in an intergovernmental negotiation, countries have different win sets that needs to overlap. Later in the same vein, also liberal intergovernmentalism provided interesting insights as to how societal positions of important actors in the domestic realm determines government positions in an intergovernmental negotiation. However, we found that one important drawback of these approaches was that they were conceiving all of this as interactions between two realms that remain separate, namely an international realm on the one hand and a domestic realm. Here, we see that increasingly the EU political system is becoming very unique, and I think we see this increasingly with the debt crisis, that domestic and European political arenas become increasingly interpenetrated. For instance, it's very interesting to see that Christine Lagarde, at the time French Ministry for Economics, and Wolfgang Schäuble, both of them actually made efforts to talk to the other countries' public opinion, giving interviews in the national press, respectively in France and Germany, to try to convince citizens from the neighboring country to their own from their own views. And in this interpenetrated politics game, actually agreement is more a necessity than an option. So leaders do have to agree because interdependence has become so important. And also we called it a simultaneous double game because all of this is taking place, is happening simultaneously. Real-time deliberation and reaction from public opinion to the debate is having an impact on how leaders formulate change and reconfigure their positions in the European negotiation. So the approach here is, you will not be surprised, I think, is very much focused on discourse. To explain these dynamics, we see that positions are being formulated but also reconfigured in elite discourse. And here, as I mentioned earlier, of course, these discourses are constrained by past choices and past traditions. Here, I will not expand on this, but ordoliberalism versus Keynesian tradition of interventionism in France. But it's interesting to see that these traditions are not inescapable path dependencies. There is still space for change, for dynamics of change in the discourse and in the actions as well, of course. So discursive institutionalism focuses on discourse not only as the substantive content of ideas, but also on discourse as an interactive process between political actors. And the very important dimension here is the legitimization of ideas and of actions that are justified by these very ideas. The reason why discursive institutionalism, or the specificity of this framework, because this is a question that often comes, the difference of this approach with other constructivist kinds of approaches is that it's institutionalist. And why? Because institutional settings, in the plural, play an important role both as opportunities and as constraints. Here we can have simple polities, like in France, where, to put it in a very sketchy manner, chains of political command are quite direct, versus compound polities, where the government has to accommodate its action with a number of veto players of other actors that also have an important role in the decision-making process. But also, a very important point is that this approach does not put power relations on the side. And here, for instance, I don't know if I will have an opportunity to talk about it again, but of course it's very important to bear in mind that in the time that this European debate is taking place, there's also a lot of elections at stake in Germany at the regional level, especially in that year. And this is, of course, very important to understand Angela Merkel's course of action. So very briefly, we looked what we are doing, and this are also the three different sections of the papers and the unfolding of the presentation. We focused on three levels of discourse. First, policy ideas related to policy measures and solutions. So both the economic dimension and the institutional dimension. Second, at a more general level, programmatic ideas related to larger policy paradigms and to broader economic philosophies. And third, norms, values, and identities. We pick up these categories from the literature in public policy. You can see the references. And as far as the identity dimension is concerned, this is more inspired by the literature on social movements and the storytelling about whenever you have a conflict, you also have stories picturing antagonists and protagonists of the story, as we will see. Briefly on the methods, the paper actually analyzes all press conferences by Nicolas Sarkozy and Angela Merkel in this period, so October 2009, December 2011, and we focused on the analysis of a number of frames of the debate. So let's start with economic and institutional policy solutions. The first thing at stake in 2010, when the crisis broke out and when it became very urgent to take action, was to activate financial solidarity. So it was actually a challenge for the French president to get the German chancellor to accept to activate some kind of financial solidarity. So, as you can see here on the graph, the interesting thing is that on the German side, you see a category, it's a Stability and Growth Pact, and actually this is, in this entire period of time, Angela Merkel focused on the idea that member states should stick to the old existing rules and that some things were not allowed to do in the treaties, that bailouts actually were prohibited by treaty rules, and that Stability and Growth Pact rules should be used. However, in the course of 2010 and 2011, as you see, there is some kind of convergence on adopting the EMS and the EFSF. So I should say here that the graphs themselves show only the salience of the frames in the material. Sorry?
How did you measure that?
Okay, so the numbers are frames occurrences. So it's in absolute terms. So the idea is that it's interesting to see the comparison between France and Germany. I mean, these numbers do actually not mean anything themselves. Plus, I was going to add, it's always important to have the interpretation, because sometimes it's very difficult to know why a specific frame is more salient at one point in time or at another point in time. And for instance, if you look at EMS in 2011, after delaying the support and the adoption of financial solidarity on the side of Germany, so Angela Merkel had to talk a lot about it to justify why she eventually had accepted to move on to this kind of financial solidarity. If you look Eurobonds, the French president already in 2010, that's in black, was trying to advocate to push for Eurobonds, but you see no reaction on the side of German discourse. I move on to the second phase, and this here is more 2011. I mean, unfortunately, I won't have the time to comment on every category on all graphs. So the second thing that happened is the balance or the counterpart of activating financial solidarity was the institutionalization, or even more the constitutionalization of austerity. So first, Angela Merkel accepted to give some response to a long-standing French demand for a so-called gouvernement économique. Actually, they only agreed to meet a little more often. We can discuss whether this is a real gouvernement économique, but anyway, discursively, this was presented by Nicolas Sarkozy as a great victory of the French of at last obtaining this gouvernement économique from Germany. On the other side, Nicolas Sarkozy moves on to almost to accepting the principle of having quasi-automatic sanctions for countries that would infringe on common rules. 5 minutes, wow. And as you may know, also the Golden Rule was the new emerging theme. As you can see here, the Golden Rule becomes, on the side of Germany, a very important theme. Economic philosophies and paradigms, obviously a French turn from the Keynesian dirigist tradition to the German austerity policy inspired by the tradition of Ordnungspolitik, by ordoliberalism. But Sarkozy was very successful in framing it not as austerity, but as convergence. So Sarkozy talked a lot about convergence in Europe. Of course, it was mainly convergence of France with Germany. If you look here, on the other hand, Angela Merkel does almost not talk about convergence at all. Austerity here, we can see, is the main frame on the German side, but becomes also important on the French side. But the most interesting, I think, dimension is that of norms and identities. It's quite thin, actually, not many references to values. On the one hand, on the German side, the main norm is that of stability culture, and to a lesser extent, the idea of Wohlstand. Nicolas Sarkozy could legitimize its turn toward austerity by talking about solidarity. And this is how he really profited himself as the white knight flying to rescue Greece, and as he could also domestically legitimize quite successfully this turn towards a German-style program. Last point, identities. I will not talk so much about protagonists, but antagonists. here the gap did not really close. For Sarkozy, the bad guys were always the markets, the speculators who were attacking vulnerable countries. On the other hand, Angela Merkel had this moral stand and discourse about the responsibility of the now so-called the infamous pigs country. This quote here at the bottom shows that she did not buy into the story of the markets being responsible for what happened in Europe. In 2011, the only thing on which both countries could agree on is that the UK should not try to tell Euro countries what they have to do, and that if the UK doesn't want the fiscal compact, then it should not take it, but that France and Germany will go ahead anyway. So, to conclude, we see that the very complex set of discursive interactions shaped both policy outcomes and the way both leaders legitimized this outcome, both in the European politics arena and also in the domestic arena. And this happened simultaneously, forcing both leaders to reconfigure their position and to move on some dimensions of the debate. Paradoxically, Sarkozy gave more, we could say, with a major conversion to austerity policy, and he was still quite successful in framing his action and legitimize his moves both outside and at home. As we've talked a lot about it, this foundational sequence of the crisis had long-lasting implications. We see now it's not that easy for François Hollande to reverse the frame, to reverse the positions, to reverse the debate, to go back to stimulus policy. And very last point, it's, I think, very challenging to deal with this paper in the sense that this is an ongoing story, of course, and I mean, we wrote this paper a while ago already, 6 months, a year ago, so thank you for your comments and remarks. Sorry for being too long.
No, you use your last 5 minutes very well. Okay, thank you very much, Amandine.